Hi, everybody. So by this point, we've identified our risks and assessed our risks and have a value for them. Now we've got to figure out the best way to mitigate them. The most common is risk reduction. With risk reduction, we're going to lessen either the probability of the risk or the impact of the risk. So for example, I can't lessen the probability of rain, but I can lessen the impact by bringing an umbrella. I can't lessen the impact of malware infestation on a system, but I can lessen the probability of getting that malware by having anti-malware software installed. So with risk reduction, we're trying to lessen one of those. And again, we're going to keep reducing risk until we get to a level that's acceptable to senior management. If we reduce all the way to zero, we've actually avoided the risk, but you can't always do that. As a general rule, we look to reduce or transfer risk, so we can still perform the activities we want to do, rather than not do those things in order to avoid all risks. So when we talk about putting security controls in place, we talk about doing things like implementing policies like separation of duties, or implementing physical controls like door locks and security cards. These are risk reduction controls. If we determine after research that the risk is too great, we choose to avoid it. So another option is risk transference. Risk transference means we're going to share in the loss potential. So for example, maybe I'm worried about being able to provide availability that's necessary to satisfy my customers. So I outsource and I have my infrastructure migrated to the cloud. And I take advantage of the uptime that's promised by Amazon. And if Amazon Web Services doesn't provide the degree of resources necessary to get the high availability that I want, then there's a reimbursement based on the service level agreement. So if there's a loss, they will always share in the loss with me. In another example, what if I don't have the skills to develop a certain type of software? I outsource to a third-party software development company. And if they don't meet the requirements, again, usually the contract calls for some sort of negotiation if the parties don't perform according to the requirements. So with risk transference, we're trying to share in the loss potential so that it doesn't weigh us down. Now, risk acceptance comes when either there's nothing we can do about a risk, or if we determine that it's too expensive to mitigate a risk. Sometimes the cost of mitigation is greater than the potential for loss. You know, we had an earthquake in the DC area several years ago, and I wondered how often we have earthquakes in this area. So I did my research and found out that in the past 100 years, we've only had a handful of them, and they've only been low impact. So based on this information, we decided we couldn't justify the cost of mitigation for this risk, and we would just accept it. But we do have an emergency preparedness kit and business continuity plan. So when we choose to accept a risk, it doesn't mean we don't have some kind of disaster recovery plan or business continuity plan to deal with it. It's important that with risk acceptance, we show our due diligence, because risk acceptance is not the same as ignoring a risk. All right, now when we talk about mitigation strategies and risk reduction, we have to remember the idea of layered defense. With layered defense, we want technical, physical, and administrative controls if possible. Technical controls include encryption, firewalls, intrusion detection, and things like that. Physical controls include things like door locks, gates, lighting, and security guards. Administrative controls include policies, procedures, standards, and guidelines. Those are the sort of things that come down from senior leadership as directives that influence security. So all three of these types of controls make up a good layered defense. Now, within each of those categories of controls, we also have other controls that serve specific functions. So within physical, administrative, and technical controls, we can have preventative, deterrent, corrective, and detective controls. For detective controls in the physical category, you have things like motion detectors, building alarms, and so forth. For preventative controls under the administrative category, you could have the separation of duties policy. An example of a deterrent administrative control would be an employee handbook that tells you what you can and cannot do. A corrective administrative control could be a termination procedure. So each of these major categories of controls have these additional types of controls that serve specific functions. This is all part of the layered defense. You don't want to rely too heavily on one type of control or another, because any kind of control can be bypassed. All right, so the quick wrap up for risk mitigation. Primarily, our responses are to reduce, transfer, or accept risk. Reducing risk is going to lessen the probability or impact. Transference is going to be using insurance or service level agreements or contracts with a third party that is going to help shoulder part of the loss. Risk acceptance comes when the cost of the countermeasure is more expensive than the potential for loss, or when you just can't mitigate the risk. When it goes back to reduction of risk, generally we mitigate risks and reduce risks through controls. Some controls are proactive, some controls are reactive, but we need to make sure we have technical, physical, and administrative controls in place. The proactive controls are preventative and deterrent. The reactive controls are detective and corrective.